guys, I'm here to read another chapter from Twitches. So the next chapter is called My Grandmother. So, I myself had two separate encounters with witches before I was 8 years old. From the first, I escaped unharmed, but the second occasion, I was not so lucky. Things happened to me that will probably make you scream. You read about them, Things happen to me that will probably make you scream when you read about them. That can't be helped. The truth must be told. The fact that I'm still here and able to speak to you, however peculiar I may look, it is due entirely to my wonderful grandmother. My grandmother is Norwegian. The Norwegians know all about witches. For Norway, with its black forests and icy mountains, it is where the first witches come from. My father and my mother were also Norwegian, but because my father had a business in England, I was born there and had lived there and started going to an English school. Twice a year on Christmas and in the summer, we went back to Norway to visit my grandmother. This old lady, as far as I could gather, was just about the only surviving relative we had on either side of our family. She was my mother's mother, and I absolutely adored her. When she and I were together, we spoke in either Norwegian or English. It didn't matter which. We were equally fluent in both languages. I have to admit that I felt closer to her than my mother. Soon after my 7th birthday, my parents took me as usual to spend Christmas with my grandmother in Norway, and it was over there, while my father and mother and I were driving the icy weather of the north of Oslo, that our car skidded off the road and went tumbling into the rocky ravine. My parents were killed, and I was firmly strapped into the back seat and received only a cut on the forehead. I won't go into the horrors of the terrible afternoon. I still get shivers when I think about it. I finished up, of course, back to my grandmother's house with her arms around me tight, and both of us crying the whole night long. So there's a picture of him and his grandmother. What are you going to do now? I asked her through the tears. You will stay here with me, she said. I will look after you. Aren't I going back to England? No, she said. I could never do that. Heaven shall take my soul, but Norway shall keep my bones. The very next day, in order that we might both try to forget about great sadness, my grandmother started telling me stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and I was enthralled by everything she told me. But I didn't become really excited until she got on the subject of witches. She was apparently a great expert on these creatures, and she made it very clear to me that with her witch stories, unlike most of the others, were not imaginary tales. They were all true. They were the gospel truth. They were history. Everything she was telling me about witches was actually happened, and I had to better believe it. What was far worse was that witches were still with us. They were all around us, and I had better believe that, too. Are you really being truthful, Grandmama? Really, really truthful? Yes, my darling, she said. You won't last long in this world if you don't know how to spot a witch when you see one. But you told me that witches look like ordinary women, Grandmama. So how am I to spot them? You must listen to me, my grandmother said. You must remember everything I tell you. After that, all you can do is cross your heart and pray to heaven and hope for the best. We were all in a big living room of her house in Oslo, and I was ready for bed. The curtains were never drawn in the house, and through the windows I could see huge snowflakes falling slowly to an outside world that was as black as tar. My grandmother was tremendously old and wrinkled, with a massive wide body which was smothered in gray lace. She sat there majestic, her armchair filling every inch of it. Not even a mouse could have squeezed and sit beside her. I myself, just 7 years old, was crouched on the floor of her feet, wearing pajamas, dressing gown, and slippers. You swear you aren't pulling my leg, I kept saying to her. You swear you aren't just pretending? Listen, she said. I have known no less than 5 children who have simply vanished off the face of this earth, never to be seen again. The witches took them. I still think you're just trying to frighten me, I said. I'm trying to make sure you don't go to the same way, she said. I love you and I want you to stay with me. Tell me about the children who disappeared, I said. My grandmother was the only grandmother I ever met who smoked cigars. She lit one now, and long black cigar, and it smelt of burning rubber. The first child I knew who disappeared, she said, was called Ranglin Henson. Ranglin was 8 at the time. She was playing with her little sister in the lawn. Their mother, who was breaking bread in the kitchen, came outside for a breath of air. Where's Ringchild? She asked. She went away with a tall lady, the little sister said. What tall lady? The mother said. The tall lady in the white gloves, the little sister said. You took Ranglin by the hand and led her away. No one, my grandmother said, ever saw Ranglin again. Didn't they search for her? I asked. They searched for miles around. Everyone in the town helped, but they never found her. What happened to the other children? I asked. They vanished just as Ranglin did. How, Grandmama? How did they vanish? In every case, a strange lady who's seen outside the household just before it happened. But how did they vanish? I asked. The second one was very peculiar, my grandmother said. There was a family called Christensen. They lived in the Homoken, and they all had an old oil painting in the living room, which they were very proud of. The painting showed some ducks in the yard outside the farmhouse. There were no people in the painting, just a flock of ducks on the grassy farmyard and a farmhouse in the back. Here's a picture of the grandmother and the grandson. It was a large painting and rather pretty. Well, one day their daughter Solvage came home from school eating an apple. She said a nice lady had given her on the street. The next morning little Solvage was not in her bed. Her parents searched everywhere for her, but they couldn't find her. Then all of a sudden her father shouted, There she is. That's Solvage feeding the ducks, and he was pointing to the oil painting, and sure enough Solvage was she was standing in the farmyard in the act of throwing bread into the ducks out of the basket. The father rushed up to the painting and touched her, but that didn't help. She was simply part of the painting, just a picture painted on the canvas. Did you ever see that painting, Grandmama? Was the little girl in it? Many times, my grandmother said, and the peculiar thing was the little Solvage kept changing her position in the picture. One day she would actually be inside the farmhouse where you could see her face looking out the window. Another day she would be far over the left and the duck in her arms. Did you see her moving in the picture, Grandmama? Nobody did. Whenever she was whether outside feeding the ducks or inside looking out the window, she was always motionless, just a figure painted in oils. It was all very odd, her grandmother said. Very odd indeed. And what was most odd of all was that as the years went by, she kept growing older in the picture. In 10 years, the small girl had become a young woman. In 30 years, she was middle-aged. Then, all at once, 54 years after it happened, she disappeared in the picture altogether. You mean she died? I said. Who knows, my grandmother said. Some very mysterious things go on in the world of witches. That's two you've told me about, I said. What happened to the third one? The third one was little Bridget Sevens. My grandmother said. She lived just across the road from us. One day she started growing feathers all over her body. Within a month she had turned. So here's a picture of the painting and the dad looking for his daughter. White chickens. Her parents kept her for years in a pen in the garden. She even laid eggs. What color eggs? I said. Brown ones, my grandmother said. The biggest eggs I've ever seen in my life. My mother made omelets out of them. Delicious they were. I gazed up at my grandmother, who sat there like an ancient queen on her throne. Her eyes were misty gray, and they seemed to be looking at something many miles away. The cigar was the only real thing about her at that moment. The smoke it made billowed around her head in blue clouds. but the little girl who had been a chicken didn't disappear. I said, no, not Bridget. She lived on for many years, laying her brown eggs. You said all of them disappeared. I made a mistake, my grandmother said. I am getting old. I can't remember everything. What happened to the fourth child? I asked. The fourth was a boy called Harold, my grandmother said. One morning his skin went all grayish yellow. Then it became hard and crackly like a shell of a nut. But everything in the boy had turned into stone. Stone, I said. You mean real stone? Granite, she said. I'll take you to see him if you'd like. They still keep him in the house. He stands in the hall, a little stone statue. Visitors lean their umbrellas up against him. Although I'm not very young, I was not prepared to believe everything my grandmother told me, and yet she spoke with such conviction, with such utter seriousness, with never a smile on her face and a twinkle in her eye, that I found myself beginning to wonder. Go on, Grandmama, I said. You told me there were 5 altogether. What happened to the last one? Would you like to puff of my cigar? She said. I'm only 7, Grandmama. I don't care what your age you are, she said. You'll never catch a cold if you smoke cigars. What about number 5, Grandmama? Number 5, she said, chewing the end of her. So here's a picture of the boy as a chicken, and here's the picture of the boy as the statue with the umbrellas. Cigar, as though it was a delicious asparagus, was rather an interesting case. The 9-year-old boy called Leaf was a summer holidaying with his family on the Forge, and while the family was picnicking and swimming off some rocks, one of those little islands, young Leaf dived into the water with his father, who was watching him, noticing that he stayed under unusually long time. When he came to the surface at last, he wasn't Leaf anymore. What was he, Grandmama? He was a porpoise. He couldn't have been. He was a lovely young porpoise, she said, as friendly as could be. Grandmama, I said. Yes, my darling, did he really and truly turn into a porpoise? Absolutely, she said. I knew his mother well. He told me all about it. She told me how Leaf and the porpoise stayed with them all that afternoon, giving his brothers and sisters ride on his back. They were a wonderful time, and they all waved and flipped at them, swam away, and to never be seen again. But Grandmama, I said, how did they know that the porpoise was actually Leaf? He talked to them, Grandmother said. He laughed and he joked with them all the time. He was giving them rides. But wasn't there the most tremendous fuss when this happened, I asked. Not much, my grandmother said. You must remember that here in Norway we are used to that sort of thing. There is witches everywhere. There is probably one living on the street in a very moment. It's time you went to bed. A witch wouldn't come in through my window at night, would she? I asked, quirked a little. No, my grandmother said. A witch will never do silly things like climbing up the drippings or breaking into people's houses. You'll be quite safe in your bed. Come along, I'll tuck you in. So became a dolphin. That's what a porpoise is. See him giving his siblings rides? And that's the end of that chapter. Tomorrow we'll read How to Recognize a Witch. Have a good night.